50 degrees below zero doesn't just bite. It shatters steel, freezes diesel, and stops a human heart in minutes. When the Great Freeze hit Blackwood, millions in modern insulation meant nothing. Survival came down to one woman's dirt-covered, stone-roofed bunker. The very tomb the entire town had mocked. The town of Blackwood, Colorado, nestled high in the Rockies, was no stranger to winter. Its residents were wealthy, resilient, and fiercely proud of their high-tech, architecturally stunning mountain chalets. Floor-to-ceiling, triple-glazed windows, heated driveways, and automated climate control were the local standards. So, when Alice Higgins purchased a barren, wind-swept 2-acre plot just outside the town limits and immediately hired an excavator to tear a massive 15-foot-deep trench into the earth, the locals assumed she was putting in a foundation for another mega-mansion. They were wrong. Alice, a 52-year-old former structural engineer from Chicago, wasn't building a mansion. She was building an underground earthship, and its most controversial feature was the roof, a massive, self-supporting vault made entirely of 40 tons of locally quarried granite and limestone, sealed with a specialized waterproof membrane and buried under 4 feet of dense soil. The ridicule began almost the moment the first stone slabs were delivered. Arthur Pendleton, a prominent local real estate developer, whose sprawling glass and steel estate sat on the ridge directly overlooking Alice's property, was the first to vocalize the town's collective amusement. Standing at the counter of Miller's Hardware, sipping a complimentary coffee, Arthur shook his head as Alice loaded heavy-duty masonry anchors into her truck. "Building yourself a mausoleum, Alice," Arthur called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "You know, if you wanted to be buried in Blackwood, the cemetery plots on Oak Hill have much better drainage." A few locals chuckled. Alice merely adjusted her work gloves, offering Arthur a polite but icy smile. "Granite has a thermal mass that fiberglass and spray foam can't compete with, Arthur. When the wind strips the heat from your glass walls, my roof will hold the Earth's core temperature." "Right," Arthur scoffed. "And when that 40-ton rock ceiling collapses under the snow load, at least you'll save us the trouble of digging a grave." The joke spread like wildfire. Soon, Alice's project was dubbed Higgins' Folly and the Stone Tomb. Teenagers would drive by and take pictures of the bizarre, dome-like stone structure rising from the pit, posting them online with mocking captions. The local gossip, led by a well-connected socialite named Sarah Jenkins, painted Alice as a doomsday prepper who had lost her grip on reality. But the ridicule was the least of Alice's problems. The real drama came from her own family. In late September, as the leaves began to turn a sharp, fiery orange, a sleek black SUV pulled onto the dirt driveway of Alice's construction site. Out stepped David Higgins, Alice's estranged younger brother, accompanied by a man carrying a leather briefcase. Alice climbed out of the excavation pit, wiping dust from her forehead. She hadn't seen David in 3 years, not since the prolonged and bitter dispute over their late father's estate. "David," Alice said, her voice guarded, "what are you doing here?" "Trying to save you from yourself, Alice," David replied, gesturing dismissively at the stone vault taking shape in the earth. "What is this? Look at you. You're living in a trailer, burning through your half of Dad's money to build a cave." "It's a geothermally stabilized earth shelter," Alice corrected sharply, "and my finances are none of your concern." The man beside David stepped forward. "Ms. Higgins, I am Harrison Cole, David's attorney. We are filing an injunction to freeze your trust assets. Given your recent erratic behavior, your isolation, and this unconventional construction, your brother is petitioning for temporary conservatorship. We believe you are experiencing a mental health crisis." Alice stared at them, the sheer audacity of the ambush stealing the breath from her lungs. David wasn't here out of brotherly concern. He wanted control of the remaining family trust, and he was using her unconventional home as proof of insanity. "You think building a sustainable home makes me crazy?" Alice demanded, her hands balling into fists. "I think burying yourself under 1,000,000 pounds of rock in a freezing mountain pass makes you a danger to yourself," David shot back. "The town council thinks so too." Arthur Pendleton gave a formal statement to Harrison here. "He says your structure is unpermitted for habitation and structurally unsound." Alice's eyes flared. Arthur had crossed the line from a nagging neighbour to a direct threat to her freedom. But Alice was an engineer. She thrived on stress tests. "My structural blueprints were signed off by the state board, David," Alice said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "The county granted the agricultural residential exemption because I'm off-grid. If you and your lawyer want to drag me into court, do it. But you will lose, and I will countersue for malicious prosecution." She turned her back on them and climbed back down the ladder into the earth. The legal battle that followed over the next 6 weeks was exhausting. David tried every trick in the book, dragging Alice into competency hearings and freezing her bank accounts temporarily. But Alice's meticulous documentation, her flawless mathematical proofs regarding the load-bearing capacity of the stone arches, and her sharp, lucid testimony ultimately humiliated David in court. The judge threw the petition out, ruling that eccentricity was not a psychiatric condition. By the first week of November, the legal freeze was lifted, and the shelter was finished. Alice covered the thick stone roof with an industrial moisture barrier, layered it with gravel for drainage, and buried the entire thing under 4 feet of topsoil. From the road, it looked like nothing more than a gentle, grassy knoll with a heavy, steel-reinforced oak door built into the hillside, flanked by a thick glass block window. The town laughed. They called her the Mole of Blackwood. They had no idea that the sky was about to fall. By mid-December, the winter had been unusually mild, further fueling the town's mockery of Alice's subterranean fortress. Arthur Pendleton threw lavish holiday parties in his glass-walled mansion, pointing down at the dark, snow-dusted mound on Alice's property, using her as a punchline for his wealthy guests. But high above the Arctic Circle, a catastrophic meteorological anomaly was taking shape. A massive atmospheric blocking pattern, an omega block, had formed over the Pacific, disrupting the jet stream. The polar vortex, a swirling mass of dense, brutally cold Arctic air that normally stays confined to the North Pole, splintered. A massive lobe of this super-chilled air broke off and began a rapid, unimpeded slide directly down the spine of the Rocky Mountains. The National Weather Service issued their first warnings on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the tone of the broadcasts had shifted from cautious advisory to outright panic. Meteorologists were using phrases like historically unprecedented, generational freeze, and unsurvivable exposure. Down in her shelter, Alice was already prepared. The genius of her stone roof wasn't just its strength, it was its immense thermal mass. The walls and ceiling, buried deep underground, had spent the summer and fall absorbing the Earth's ambient temperature. No matter what happened above, the stone radiated a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. A small, high-efficiency wood stove was all she needed to push the interior temperature to a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. She had a hand pump for her deep well water, a massive pantry of dry goods, and battery banks charged by a discrete solar array. Up on the ridge, Arthur Pendleton was feeling confident. He ran into Alice at the grocery store as she was buying a few last-minute fresh items. The aisles were chaotic, people fighting over bread and bottled water. "Stocking up for the apocalypse, Alice?" Arthur sneered, his cart full of expensive wines and imported cheeses. "I just had a 50-kilowatt diesel generator installed, automatic transfer switch. When the grid goes down, my house won't even blink. You sure you won't freeze to death in that damp cave of yours?" "Diesel gels at 15 degrees below zero, Arthur," Alice said quietly, placing a bag of apples into a basket. "Unless you added winterizer and buried your fuel lines below the frost line, your generator is going to choke." Arthur rolled his eyes. "It's commercial grade, Alice. I think I'll be fine." The storm hit on Friday night, but it wasn't a blizzard. It was a silent, terrifying descent of cold. There was no snow, just a howling, shrieking wind that swept down from the peaks like a physical blow. At 8 p.m., the temperature in Blackwood was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it had plummeted to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 a.m., the thermometer hit minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill pushed the effective temperature to an incomprehensible minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The infrastructure of Blackwood, designed for wealthy luxury rather than Arctic survival, began to tear itself apart. First, the power grid failed. The sheer demand from thousands of heating systems running on maximum overdrive blew transformers across the county. The town plunged into darkness. In Arthur's mansion, the lights flickered and died. He smirked in the dark, waiting for the familiar hum of his massive diesel generator. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The engine groaned, sputtered, and violently died. Alice had been right. The extreme, sudden cold had turned the diesel fuel in the exposed outdoor tank into a thick, waxy sludge. The engine couldn't pull it through the lines. Arthur panicked. His home, a marvel of modern architecture, was mostly glass. Glass has terrible insulation properties. Without the massive radiant floor heating system, the temperature inside the sprawling mansion began to free fall. Within an hour, his expensive smart thermostat read 30 degrees Fahrenheit. An hour after that, the water inside his luxury copper pipes began to freeze and expand. In the valley below, Alice sat in an armchair, reading a novel by the soft golden light of a battery-powered lamp. The heavy stone roof above her head was completely impervious to the shrieking wind. The earth surrounding her home acted as an impenetrable blanket. The wood stove crackled happily, keeping the room at a balmy 68 degrees Fahrenheit. She couldn't hear the wind. She couldn't hear the snapping of trees in the forest. It was deeply, profoundly peaceful. But the peace was an illusion, shattered by the horrific reality unfolding above ground. By sunrise, the actual ambient temperature hit minus 51 degrees Fahrenheit. It was cold enough to freeze exposed skin solid in less than 3 minutes. Propane tanks in the town lost pressure, rendering backup heaters useless. Cellular towers, their backup batteries frozen solid, went dead. The emergency services were completely paralyzed. Fire trucks and ambulances couldn't start, their engine blocks cracked by the cold. Blackwood was trapped. Alice was brewing her morning coffee when she heard it. It was faint at first, muffled by the 4 feet of earth and the thick oak door. Thump! Thump! She paused, the copper kettle in her hand hovering over the French press. She walked to the heavy steel-reinforced door and pressed her ear against the freezing metal handle. Thump! Thump! It was a desperate, rhythmic pounding. Someone was out there, dying on her doorstep. Alice unlatched the heavy iron deadbolts and braced herself. She pulled the door inward. The wind screamed into the airlock chamber, a blast of cold so absolute it felt like inhaling broken glass. Falling through the doorway, collapsing onto the concrete floor of the antechamber, in a heap of frost-covered designer winter gear, was Arthur Pendleton. His face was a ghastly, waxy white, his lips blue, his eyelashes caked in thick ice. He was shaking so violently his teeth were chipping against each other. Behind him, huddled in the freezing vestibule, were 3 other people. Sarah Jenkins, the town gossip, clutching her teenage daughter, both crying tearlessly, their faces paralyzed by the frost. Arthur looked up at Alice, his arrogant eyes now wide with absolute, primal terror. "Please," Arthur gasped, his voice barely a croak, completely stripped of its former pride. "My house, the glass, it shattered. Please, Alice. We're dying." Alice did not hesitate. The grievances of the past 6 months vanished in the face of the brutal, unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. She grabbed Arthur by the collar of his frozen North Face parka and hauled him over the threshold. Sarah and her daughter Chloe stumbled in right behind him, crying out as the sudden contrast of the airlock's slightly warmer air hit their frost-bitten skin. Alice slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the 3 deadbolts. Instantly, the shrieking howl of the wind was cut off, replaced by the heavy, muffled silence of the underground sanctuary. "Get their wet clothes off! Now!" Alice barked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. She didn't wait for them to comply. She dropped to her knees and began yanking Arthur's ice-caked boots from his feet. His hands were curled into stiff, useless claws, the skin a terrifying shade of translucent grey. "My hands," Arthur whimpered, his teeth chattering so violently he bit his own lip, sending a trickle of blood down his chin. "Alice, I can't feel my hands. They burn. God, they burn." "Do not rub them," Alice commanded, batting Sarah's hands away as the woman frantically tried to massage her daughter's frozen fingers. "You'll destroy the tissue. The ice crystals in the blood will tear the cells apart. We need lukewarm water, not hot. The core temperature comes first." For the next hour, Alice's mocked stone tomb transformed into a triage center. She wrapped them in heavy mylar emergency blankets, seating them close, but not too close, to the radiant heat of the wood stove. She heated pots of water on the cast-iron flat top, bringing the temperature to a precise 104 degrees Fahrenheit, using a digital meat thermometer to ensure it wouldn't cause thermal shock, and had them submerge their extremities. The pain of the thawing flesh was agonizing. Chloe sobbed into her mother's shoulder, while Arthur, the man who had practically owned Blackwood, sat on a canvas cot, weeping silently into his hands. As the color slowly began to return to their skin, the reality of their surroundings set in. The interior of the shelter was a marvel of utilitarian efficiency. The curved stone ceiling, composed of tightly fitted granite blocks, glowed warmly in the amber light. The air was fresh, cycling through a passive geothermal tube system that pre-warmed the outside air before it entered the room. There was no draft, no condensation, and no fear. Sarah looked around, clutching a mug of instant broth Alice had thrust into her hands. It's so warm in here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Arthur's house. The wind just tore right through it. The big window in the great room, the one overlooking the valley? It imploded. The glass just shattered from the cold. The wind threw it across the room like shrapnel. Arthur stared at the stone floor. "I was a fool," he rasped, his voice devoid of its usual booming arrogance. "I thought money could buy immunity from nature. My diesel gelled. The backup battery for the smart home system drained in an hour trying to run the relays. We walked a quarter-mile down the ridge. If your light hadn't been shining through that glass block window..." He trailed off, shuddering. Alice nodded, tending to the fire. "Thermal mass," she said quietly. "Granite doesn't care about the wind chill. But we have a problem. This shelter is provisioned for one person, maybe two in a pinch. With 4 of us, the oxygen consumption increases. I'll have to manually clear the intake vent if the snowdrifts cover the geothermal pipes. Suddenly, Arthur's head snapped up, his eyes widening in horror as a delayed realization hit him. "Alice!" The crash. Alice paused, a log suspended in her hand. "What crash?" "On our way down the ridge," Arthur stammered, his breathing accelerating. Before the whiteout got too thick, there was a vehicle on the lower access road. It had slid off the embankment and hit a pine tree. The engine was dead. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. "Who is driving on the access road in this? The State Highway Patrol closed Interstate 70 yesterday." "It was a black SUV, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Illinois plates." "Alice! It looked exactly like the one your brother drives." "I think he came back." The silence in the stone room became deafening, save for the crackle of the fire. David. Her brother had likely driven up from Chicago, either to launch another legal assault or to personally oversee the freezing of her assets, only to get caught in the meteorological hammer blow of the Omega block. "How long ago?" Alice demanded, her engineer's mind immediately calculating variables: distance, wind speed, human survival limits at -50 degrees Fahrenheit. "An hour," Sarah choked out. "Maybe an hour and a half. Alice, you can't go out there. The air, it freezes in your throat. You'll die." Alice looked at the heavy oak door. Beyond it lay a frozen hellscape that was actively murdering the town above them. David had tried to ruin her. He had tried to have her locked away. But he was her brother, and leaving him in a steel coffin on the side of the road was not an equation she could live with. "Arthur, keep feeding the stove. 1 log every 45 minutes. No more." "Sarah." "Keep Chloe wrapped up," Alice instructed, her voice devoid of panic, operating purely on logic. She walked over to a heavy storage locker. "I'm going to get him." Survival in extreme cold is not about bravery. It is strictly about managing heat exchange. Alice knew that stepping into -50 degrees Fahrenheit with a -70 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill would kill an exposed human in under 3 minutes. She stripped off her standard winter gear and began layering with mathematical precision. Moisture-wicking merino wool base layers, followed by a thick fleece mid-layer, and finally, a heavy-duty, heavily insulated canvas Carhartt Arctic suit. She smeared a thick layer of petroleum jelly over her cheeks, nose, and forehead, any exposed skin that might catch the wind. But the biggest danger wasn't the skin, it was the lungs. Breathing air that cold causes pulmonary edema. The lungs literally freeze, blister, and drown the victim in their own fluids. Alice took a spare piece of flexible aluminum dryer ducting, crushed it slightly, and taped it inside a heavy neoprene ski mask, routing the other end down into her jacket. She would breathe the air warmed by her own body heat. She grabbed a heavy-duty plastic utility sled, clipped a carabiner to her waist belt, and unlatched the door. When Alice stepped out of the airlock, the physical force of the cold felt like a solid blow to the chest. The world outside was an unrecognizable, terrifying landscape of swirling white and howling blackness. The cold gnawed at her instantly, searching for any microscopic gap in her armor. She kept her head down, leaning into the wind, navigating by memory and the subtle slope of the terrain. The 300 yards to the access road felt like a marathon. Her eyelashes froze instantly, her vision narrowed to a tiny slit. The breathing tube worked, but the air she pulled in still burned. She found the black SUV exactly where Arthur said it would be, its nose smashed into a massive Douglas fir. The windshield was spider-webbed, and a thick layer of rime ice had already sealed the door shut. Alice slammed her elbow into the driver's side window, but it didn't budge. She pulled a steel pry bar from her sled, wedged it into the doorframe, and threw her entire body weight against it. With a sickening crunch of ice and metal, the door popped open. David was slumped over the steering wheel. The airbags had deployed but were now deflated. He wasn't moving. His skin was a horrifying shade of blue-grey. Alice pressed two clumsy, heavily gloved fingers against his carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was incredibly faint, a slow, sluggish rhythm of a heart giving up. "David!" she screamed, her voice lost instantly in the wind. She grabbed him by the shoulders of his expensive, entirely inadequate cashmere overcoat and hauled him out of the vehicle. He was dead weight. Alice wrestled him onto the plastic utility sled, strapped him down with bungee cords, and threw a heavy wool blanket over him. The journey back was a grueling battle against physics and exhaustion. The wind pushed against her like a solid wall. Every step required a conscious, agonizing effort. The cold was beginning to seep through her layers, numbing her thighs and chilling her core. Her breathing tube was freezing up from the condensation of her own breath. Keep moving. Calculate the distance. Count the steps. 100 steps. 200. The outline of the grassy knoll that hid her sanctuary appeared through the whiteout. By the time Alice reached the heavy oak door, her vision was swimming with black spots, hypothermia clawing at the edges of her consciousness. She pounded on the door. Arthur hauled it open. Together, they dragged the sled into the airlock and sealed the door. Alice collapsed onto the concrete floor, tearing the frozen mask from her face, gasping for the warm, 55 degrees Fahrenheit air of the vestibule. They brought David inside. It took 6 hours of agonizing, slow rewarming before David regained consciousness. When his eyes finally fluttered open, he looked around the vaulted stone ceiling, the flickering shadows of the fire, and finally at the faces of his sister, Arthur Pendleton, and the others. "Alice?" David rasped, his voice weak and confused. Are we dead?" "No, David," Alice said quietly, handing him a cup of warm water. "We're underground. You're in the tomb." For the next 4 days, the Omega Block held Blackwood in a death grip. Above them, the town was decimated. Mansions turned into ice caves, water mains shattered, flooding luxury basements with water that froze solid within hours. The electrical grid was entirely compromised. But inside the earth shelter, a bizarre domestic routine took hold. The billionaire, the socialite, the corporate lawyer, and the eccentric engineer survived together. Arthur learned how to properly split a log and manage a draft on a wood stove. Sarah and Alice cooked meals from dried beans, rice, and canned tomatoes. David, humbled and physically broken by his brush with death, sat quietly, watching his sister operate the shelter with a quiet, unyielding competence. The social hierarchy of Blackwood had been completely erased. Money, status, and luxury SUVs meant absolutely nothing. The only currency that mattered was thermal mass, British thermal units, and the thick, unyielding strength of the earth. On the 5th day, the wind stopped. The temperature began a slow, staggering climb, back above 0. When Alice finally unsealed the door and led them out into the blinding sunlight, the silence was absolute. Blackwood looked like a war zone. Helicopters from the National Guard were already beginning to circle the valley, looking for survivors. Arthur stood in the snow, looking up at the ridge where his glass mansion used to sit. The roof had caved in, and the shattered windows looked like jagged teeth. He turned to look at Alice's property. From the outside, the shelter was perfectly intact, just a snowy hill with a chimney puffing a thin trail of wood smoke into the crisp blue sky. David stood beside Alice, wrapping his coat tighter around himself. He looked at the stone archway of the door, then at his sister. "I'll have my attorney drop the petition," David said, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong, Alice. About everything." Arthur stepped forward, reaching out a bandaged, frost-bitten hand to touch the cold granite wall of the entryway. He looked at Alice, his eyes filled with a profound, life-altering respect. "When the road's clear," Arthur said quietly, "I'm going to need the name of your architect." Alice smiled, the bright winter sun reflecting off the snow. "I designed it myself, Arthur, but I might have some free time to consult." When the thaw finally came, Blackwood was a graveyard of shattered glass and ruined fortunes. The multi-million-dollar estates were uninhabitable husks. Alice's shelter, the mocked stone tomb, stood untouched, a testament to physics over pretension. The town never ridiculed her again. David dropped his lawsuit, and Arthur helped rebuild the community, this time focusing on resilience, not just luxury. Sometimes survival requires digging deep and embracing the earth itself.